Welcome to the Employment Law and HR Podcast with your host, Alison Colley.
Hello and welcome to this episode 165 of the Employment Law and HR Podcast. I'm your host, Alison Colley. I'm an employment solicitor and HR specialist, and I run the firm Real Employment Law Advice, where we provide advice and support to employers and employees on all aspects of employment law. This podcast has been going now since August 2014, and I've been providing updates on all matters relating to employment law and HR and best practice, primarily for employers and HR professionals, but also for anyone who's interested in employment law. So if you do like the podcast, then do please subscribe on wherever you're listening, whether that be Spotify or iTunes. And I've also noticed recently that I've had a couple of new reviews on iTunes. So thank you very much for leaving a review. It really does help other people to find the podcast. Hopefully you'll continue to receive great value from the podcast. And this week in particular, I'm very excited about this episode. And it's been a long time coming because I actually spoke to Ed Gray, who I'm going to be interviewing today, about this topic late last year. And we sort of arranged to get together and have a chat about it on the podcast. But it couldn't come at a better time, really, because many of you will know that on the 14th of January, the business minister published an open letter to employers around domestic abuse and what workplaces can be doing to highlight the issue and to help employees. So I didn't know that this was going to be happening or that this was going to be coming out now. It's just worked out really good timing, considering I interviewed Ed about 2 weeks ago, just after the letter was published, and obviously it's coming out now. So I hope that you will enjoy the podcast. It is slightly longer than the normal episodes, but the interview ones tend to be slightly longer, and there's such great value in today's episode. But do stick around to the end, because I do have a free giveaway for you if you stick to the end, and I'll talk to you about that once you've listened to the great content in this week's episode. So I would like to welcome Ed Gray to the podcast. Welcome, Ed. Thanks for joining me today.
Morning, it's a pleasure.
Ed, can you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and a bit about your background and what you do?
For sure. So I have two business entities and I spend pretty much an equal amount of time in both. One of them is around leadership coaching. So when I'm working with businesses, I tend to be in that space, and also helping to develop people development and performance improvement strategies. So very much in that sort of consultancy coaching space when I'm working with businesses. The second entity is a therapy entity. So I'm a qualified therapist. So I spend a lot of time with individuals, and latterly in the last year or two, more time with couples and even with families. In that therapy practice, it's more around helping people individually with their difficulties. So I've been doing this for getting on for about 25 years now.
And like me, you're based on the Isle of Wight, but I understand you work with clients all over the UK, or is it further afield for you, Ed?
Yeah, so certainly for the last 10 years, it's been primarily UK. And when my wife and I moved to the Isle of Wight, we were very keen to devote our time to island life. And from the business perspective, my objective was to really focus most of my business work and the therapy practice here on the island. And that's certainly been the case over the last 2 or 3 years, more and more island-based stuff. And I also, in that regard, this year, I also have a role with the Chamber of Commerce here on the Isle of Wight, which is sort of been designed to address the COVID challenges for businesses. So I have a role which is funded by the council here to support island businesses really get through some of the COVID struggles that they're having. So it's sort of an extension of the work I do as a leadership coach in a sense.
And obviously we've met through the Chamber of Commerce and networking here on the island. And it was just by coincidence that I think we were in a Zoom meeting, maybe a LinkedIn local or something together. And you messaged me about a course that you'd recently been on. And it was great timing for me because I'd been asked a question about domestic violence and when you suspect somebody at work is the victim of domestic violence and what you do. And it had really stumped me because I hadn't had any experience or any questions about that before. And so when you coincidentally exactly the same day messaged me, it led to sort of a dialogue between us, didn't it, to get this podcast up and running. So do you want to just tell me a bit about the course that you went on?
Yeah, sure. So it is very good timing. And the course that I went on I went looking for it. And I went looking for it because there were an increasing number of people presenting in my therapy practice that were experiencing high levels of stress and relationship breakdown through both lockdowns, actually. And in some of those cases, they were definitely presenting with signs of domestic abuse or domestic violence. And that highlighted to me that in this rather niche area, it was an area that I had not as much experience and skill to address those issues with. So I went looking for a course and fortunately found one which was exceptional, that was led by an amazing woman called Rima Hawkins, Rima advises government and is one of the most senior and most experienced psychotherapists and counsellors in this field of DVA. So DVA is the term we're going to be using, I guess, through the podcast here, which means domestic violence and abuse. So it was a DVA course that captured the essential definitions of DVA and a whole range of resources that individuals could use, and by extension that employers could use as well for their employees if they are either told that their employees are currently victims of domestic abuse or violence, or if they suspect that. So it was a really useful and empowering and practical training. And since then, I've been able to use many of those tools and many of those reference points for some of my own clients, and it's proved to be very, very useful. And in one case, I would say life-saving.
Wow, that's great, isn't it? To be able to say that. And of course, as I said, it wasn't something that I've ever had to answer a question about or that's, come across my desk in my time in advising employers. And I think on reflection, that's because perhaps employers haven't wanted to sort of get involved, or perhaps there was sort of a stigma around discussing it, or for whatever reasons, traditionally it's sort of domestic violence has kind of been swept under the carpet.
This is the thing, and I think this is one of the reasons why I've started getting more and more interested in this space, because it is much, much more common than we might want to believe. And I think there is this thing both in the world of work and in domestic situations where we don't really want to turn our attention to it, because it's something, in the domain of our homes, we feel that we want our homes to be secure. We want our homes to be the place where, if anything else is going wrong in our lives, home is the safest and most nurturing place for us. Sadly, that's not the case for everyone. Not everyone, when they're at home, is safe. And what we're seeing is a significant increase in DVA being reported over both lockdown 1 and the current situation. So I think you're right. Employers don't really want to go there because it's tricky, it's awkward, and fundamentally it's something we don't, as human beings, really want to acknowledge that it happens.
Yeah, and I think this lockdown that we're currently experiencing and the previous one has, in a way, brought those sort of issues more to light, especially for employers. I was thinking about the kind of blurred lines now between work and home, where many people are working from home these days, spending more and more time there. And I guess in a way, I was thinking perhaps employees working from home empowers employers more to have conversations about what's going on at home because they are working at home, whereas previously they might have felt worried, or maybe they were overstepping the boundaries by asking about what's going on at home. They feel more empowered to do that now. So I think it's a really good time to speak about this on the podcast, but to raise awareness as well, given the increase, as we've heard on the news and in statistics, of domestic violence and the awareness that comes with it, and obviously more people working from home, which... Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. There is an open door now to do that, because when somebody's working from home, we know that the first things that people do is, have you got your IT equipment set up? Have you got the right workstation set up? If you're a good employer, you'll check everything from their health and safety around their desk to the lighting in their room and a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you're talking about setting up home working, there is an open door there to talk about the other issues that bear on being effective. And of course, it pays dividends for the employer, because if you're not discussing with your employee their home working conditions around the more, if you like, the more social side, what does your employee have? 2 dogs and 4 cats that needs to be attended to? And if their partner is not there most of the time, what happens? Is their work pattern going to be constantly interrupted? So there are real dividends for employers to really check that home working is optimal, which includes this interesting area of the potential for DVA. So we'll get into this perhaps a little later, but very subtle questions by extension of checking their workstation could be things like, what other things might happen on a regular basis for you while at home that might get in the way of your work? And that automatically opens up the possibility of talking about home working at a slightly more personal level.
And so what are the sort of signs that you would suggest employers should be looking out for in relation to this?
Sure. Well, in order to answer the question there, I guess it may be useful for listeners to be a bit clear about at least the headlines of the definitions of domestic violence and abuse. And of course, one thing I just wanted to stress here is that DVA is not necessarily just violence at a physical level. So formal definitions of DVA include everything from physical violence to sexual violence to coercive behaviours. And I think this is the piece that's often misunderstood or overlooked somehow. Anyone that is in a relationship at home which is overtly or deliberately coercive can include everything from financial coercion, things like, can I have your bank details? Which, obviously one of the things that you and I talked about, Alison, was some of the legal issues around this. I understand that actually there are some interesting legal areas around partners sharing their financial details, but coercion can be anything from persuading people to have a routine that they're not comfortable with. So definitions of DVA right now are pretty broad. Certainly I can send people links to websites and information that can define this. So therefore, coming to your question about what are the signs, they are all sorts of signs. Now, thinking about whether somebody's saying, can you pay my salary into this account, or can you pay my wife or husband's or partner's salary into this account this month instead, and give you some sort of excuse to do that. Of course, there are legal reasons why we shouldn't be doing that. There are things around money which are useful. And of course, by extension, you could just notice whether any of your employees are asking for money from other colleagues. Have you got an extra £5? Have you got a tenner you can lend me right now? And if those are unusual behaviours, then that's worthy of taking note. And I think if there's a general principle, employers should be looking out for differences in normal behaviour as best as they know. So if they know their employee well and they're deviating from those normal patterns, that may be a sign. So we're also looking for things like more tired than usual, lateness is something, certainly lateness to logging on if people are tracking that, or lateness to meetings. Also signs that an employee might say, well, I have to work late tonight, or could we pick this up at, I know it's a bit late, but could we go on that Zoom meeting at 8:00 this evening? So they're sort of unusual, because sometimes signs that people are working longer, I have to stay on this job right now. Those are there are potential signs of wanting to sort of stay late, escapism signals, we would call them. So additional stress, difficulty in prioritizing tasks, needing unusual levels of additional support in organizing work tasks. You can often see extremes at both ends of communication. So sometimes you'll notice that employees will be less communicative than normal, significantly so, they'll sort of withdraw. Others will be much, much more the other way, needing to talk, needing to chat. Have you got a moment? Those sorts of signals. So what you're really looking out for is abnormal behaviours in those fields. And of course, what's really critical is that employers don't necessarily jump to conclusions about DVA because to a degree, and I would say from my professional perspective, quite fortunately, it's a hot topic right now, but nevertheless to be aware that those sorts of things could be happening.
And I think what you're saying there is right, because all the things you were talking about and the potential signs can be related to other things, like other mental health conditions or, disabilities, that sort of thing. But ultimately, it's about the best managers know their staff, they know their people, as well as they know their friends and family. And so you should be able to, if you know your staff well, recognise if there is a sudden change in their behaviour.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting, sorry to butt in, but this idea of if DVA is being experienced at a physical level, it'd be interesting to see if on that next Zoom call or that next meeting, your employee, male or female actually, comes to that meeting with makeup, potentially covering up signs of bruising or any type of physical. So that again that may be unusual for. I mean, obviously in these days it's more usual for women to wear makeup than men. But what's interesting is in lockdown 1, there was at least a 35% rise in calls to men's advice lines. So there's quite a large increase in DVA that's being perpetrated towards men. So that's the other important signal, important sort of caveat to say to employers: keep a radar out for this, for not just for your female employees, but also for your male employees.
It's easy to forget that, isn't it? Again, it's all very new in talking about it, particularly in the workplace. So it's right for employers often make assumptions. So yes, keep in mind it's both your male and female employees.
And there is one other thing I just wanted to add here, because if we're talking about employers spotting signs, it's really important to notice when things, as best as we can, when things might tip over into DVA. So I had a couple working with me a couple of months back here, who both worked in the same business, both had to work from home. They have a very small flat. And for months, they were quite sort of literally on top of each other in terms of their space. They came to me because their relationship was under real strain. What was important for me in that context is to notice whether there was the potential to fall into DVA. Now, that's a very, very subtle area. And here's the thing. I do say the duty of care issue is something that we could talk about, Alison, in terms of any legalities around that. If heads of businesses, they have a duty of care in certain areas of well-being and mental health and so on. And it'd be interesting to see what the white paper later this year says about that in terms of mental health when that comes out. But here's the thing, employers can only do so much, and in a sense should only do so much in terms of intervening. And we could talk about that a little later, of if you do get that information, if you do have some sort of confirmation or real strong sense that it's happening, what to do about it then.
Before we move on to that, sort of the actions and things you can do and you can take, I think it's interesting to talk about the duty of care, because aside from just your general moral duty as a human being to another human being, which I always talk about, yes, you're an employer, yes, they're your staff, but you're also human beings. If someone's presenting with a problem, then you should be looking at it. And there are also the issues around the impact on their work performance and the impact on colleagues, all of those sorts of things to take into account. Yes. And then as an employer, you do have a general duty of health, safety and well-being for your staff whilst they're at work, and to a degree protecting their safety outside of that. But particularly so now where they're working from home, as I was saying earlier, I think that's where the lines are blurred more so for employers, and people need to be more aware of this sort of thing and their duty of care if employees are working at home. Yep. Because whilst domestic violence and things that are going on at home are a factor, if you're continuing to ramp up the pressure on them and not taking into account anything that might be going on at home, and they do end up having a breakdown or some other injury to themselves, then there is a potential liability there for employers, in my view, where staff are working at home, particularly now. There are a number of reasons why, as an employer, you should be looking at this, primarily just being a nice person, the impact on the business, but also the potential legal risks. So
And as I said earlier, it can start with that very, very open, gentle question, which is, how is working from home for you right now? How's that going? What is it like to be at home while you're working? What's going on around you at home? So yes, I think we're right. What we said earlier is there's an open door now to be able to tease out a bit more information. I know a lot of business leaders who are very, very reluctant to talk to their employees about anything that sounds remotely personal. Some people say to me with real deep pride, oh, no, I keep all these personal things outside the door and it's very professional. My relationship with my staff is entirely professional. I don't get involved personally. Well, here's the thing. As you were alluding to, you do have human beings in your business, and whether or not there's a fuzzy line in certain areas around the duty of care for people working from home now, nevertheless, there is this general principle that employers do have this generalized duty of care, particularly when people are working from home, and therefore they have to, in my view, they have to be able to get to a point in their conversations with their people where they're asking a little bit more personal stuff. It's a fine line. It's very nuanced. It's very subtle. And if there's a big message here in the podcast about how employers should handle this, with sensitivity, of course, because you don't want to go in and say, how's life at home? Are you getting any abuse right now? It just doesn't work.
Yeah. No. And I think if you are going to be carrying on home working post-pandemic, I would say that the time invested in actually physically going to an employee's house on the basis of doing a risk assessment and health and safety, you get a really good sense of people's home life, about how they live and about their family by going to visit them at home. Of course, you need to have the employee's permission to be able to do that. But ultimately, if you are going to be continuing it post-pandemic, that's what I would recommend.
Can I just quickly drop in there? Because sometimes when people are setting up home working, it won't necessarily be the HR person or the managing director or even their immediate boss that comes into the home. It could just be the person who deals with the IT. So, I'm just saying that every business is different. And there is, I think you're absolutely right, there is an opportunity there to get a sort of sense check about what that environment looks like and feels like for their employees.
And I've got a very small team, and I've set the business up so that staff work from home from the outset. It's always been that way. So it's been set up from the start that people work from home. But I've undertaken inductions at somebody's home office over a couple of days, doing the training there. And I've got to know them much quicker and far better than I would have done if they'd been coming into the office and we'd be doing the induction. So the things I've learned about them and their family and their likes and dislikes in a couple of days would have taken months, or even years otherwise.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the other things that I was going to mention here is that business leaders, or indeed, if a business is large enough or has someone in their business that has a leaning towards this, an interest or some skill set around this whole area, we could point to HR as an appropriate location for somebody who might be able to take ownership of this area. Then they can do quite a lot of work to help them with these potentially awkward conversations by actually integrating DVA, domestic violence and abuse policies, into their well-being and harassment and equality and well-being policies. Because one of the problems that we have with domestic violence, as we were talking about right early on, is that it feels sometimes like this is, and I even use the word niche, and it is niche in certain ways because of the unique nature of what happens when relationships spill into DVA. But it isn't unique and shouldn't be seen as unique within the business context, because it should be integrated as part of normal policy. And therefore, people who need to have those conversations, or people who are responsible more than others in a business to look after this area, can really help themselves by actually, first of all, integrating policies around this so it becomes transparent for the organization that it's not a bolt-on, it's not a specialist thing, it is part of our well-being and equality and harassment sort of agenda. But once that's there written into the business's policies, actually train the business, a minimum, I would have thought, sort of a half-day training to understand the nuts and bolts of DVA, and saying, this has been integrated into our policies around well-being, the general HR well-being policies and equality and so on. And therefore, because we haven't really directly talked to this, here's a piece of training that we can then explain what it is, how it works, what our response to this is. Now, that, of course, immediately allows individuals who might be in that situation to feel more comfortable coming forward.
Absolutely. And one of the things we're doing here is we're going to develop a domestic violence and abuse policy for employers, which will be available to download on the website by the time this podcast comes out. So we're going to do a free policy, just because obviously exploring this myself and looking into it and doing some reading and research around it, I think you're right. Having a policy in place and communicating that to managers and staff is crucial, and then hopefully employers can take that next step and get that training.
Absolutely. As I alluded to before, I would certainly advise that people putting this sort of policy together would make a point of noticing the nuances around the definitions of DVA, because, as I said before, it's not just violence, it is about coercion, and that's part of the issue. For example, isolation and, in a sense, using the COVID lockdown as an opportunity to isolate your partner, that is a constituent part of DVA. That's one of the definitions of DVA, is using isolation as a control mechanism, for example.
Okay, so let's move on then to the kind of things that as an employee you can do if you recognise that this may be a problem. How do you make that first approach, and then what would you recommend doing?
Yeah, it is tricky, and as I've said, with caution, with sensitivity is the watch phrase here. Those sensitivity is the watchword. If you're lucky, an employee will come to you and say, look, my situation at home is, and will explain in all sorts of different ways. Some people will be very explicit. My partner is doing this and this and that. Or some people may explain it in ways that might sound like, oh, this is just people getting a bit irritated with each other because of lockdown. But again, we need to be very sensitive to that. So if you're lucky, somebody will report directly to you. So I'll come to the thornier issue of, if you suspect that, what do you do? Okay, so if somebody does report to an employer, or it more often, interestingly, not the boss, because there's this, particularly if it's a male employee who's going through this, because they don't want to be seen as somehow, it is almost emasculating for many men, the sense that their female partner, if they're with a female partner, is controlling them. So, and often employees won't report to the boss because they don't want to be seen to be weak, or might threaten, they may feel that their job is being threatened by revealing this. But if they are disclosing to another colleague, there are certain rules that are really critical. I mean, I say they're rules, they're guidance, and I would strongly recommend, first of all, listen without judgment. This is really critical, that you're there to listen, but not to get involved, in a sense, because this is something I've learned for many years as a coach, but also as a therapist. Well, if you start getting involved in expressing your opinion, you're already in their drama, and you need to be able to step outside of it and just listen without judgment. Second rule really is, don't blame them, or don't excuse their partner's behavior. Don't fall into this trap that we may feel deeply for this individual, and we might ask them why they haven't left. Not a good idea, because it's not up to us. And in fact, many people leaving a DVA environment may actually not be the right solution for them anyway. And by the same token, don't tell them to leave. Next, believe them. Very important to actually believe them. It's awful when somebody discloses something and the first response is, really? Oh, surely that's not happening. It just turns those individuals right back into their shell, and the chance of them disclosing further with you, or perhaps even with anyone else, is severely limited then. Validate what they're telling you. And that doesn't mean agreeing with them. It simply means mirroring what they're saying, summarizing what they're saying, supportive comments like, thank you, glad that you told me, you're not alone. Then ask them what they feel they need. Because even though they're in the situation, believe it or not, they are the experts in their own life. They are the people who know their lives, their relationships, their situation. So even if they're not quite sure, be patient with them, allow them to set the pace of what they feel they need. And then, of course, if you can, share information with them, websites, phone numbers, contacts, and ideally arrange with them, if you can, to keep in touch with them and ask them for the safest way to do this. Maybe even suggest a code word for them that they can use with you, and what that means. You know, if they use the code word, does it mean that you call the police for them, for example? So the caveat here is whoever is at the end of this disclosure really needs to look after themselves and to not take on too much, because in my experience, when somebody discloses DVA, it can be traumatic for the listener. We can end up with this sort of vicarious trauma situation where somebody's saying, well, somebody disclosed this to me, and now I don't know what to do with this information. Part of the nuance of this is being able to manage our own emotions around that, and also be able to be open with the individual who's disclosing the fine line between confidentiality and subsequent disclosure. Because the rule is, if you genuinely are hearing this and you genuinely feel that the individual, or even the individual's partner, is at risk of major serious violence or even death, it is an obligation to report that to the police or to other authorities. So in a sense, it's a very fine line, because most people who disclose say, please don't tell anyone, please don't tell anyone. And my response typically is, well, I won't tell anyone. Of course I won't tell anyone, unless you and I agree in this conversation that it really needs to be disclosed to somebody, because it's very important that, you know, you're safe or your partner's safe. And it sounds like you're at severe risk here. And as much as possible, you get an agreement to do that. So that's the first space.
And on that note, about disclosing to the police or to another body or authority, I can imagine that people would be thinking, well, where's the line? At what point? So have you got any tips for somebody who's receiving that information and thinking, well, is this something that I need to report?
Yeah, good, very good question. And I think the reality is that if in doubt, report. But who do you report to? And if you're in doubt whether you should go directly to the police, let's say, then there are a whole bunch of organizations which I can sort of share with listeners by way of resources, where you can go for advice on these very matters. Because if you don't know, get the best advice, because it can damage relationships significantly, and it can make situations worse at home if things are revealed too soon to the authorities. However, again, I have to say, if you are convinced that the individual is at serious risk, or anyone else at home is at risk, like children, for example, then it is incumbent on us. I think it's a moral responsibility, and you're better positioned than I'm about where the legal lines are drawn on this, to do something about that. But if you feel reluctant to contact the police, there are lots of organizations who can suggest what your next move could be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And we can put lots of links into the show notes for the podcast, which will appear
and just to say, some of those links are very specific. You know, some of those links are specific to abuse that men are receiving. Some people are experiencing significant abuse around other gender issues or gender identity issues. And there are a growing number of organizations, for example, even in ethnic groups, so GFM and a whole bunch of other stuff. So if what's being disclosed to you is in one of those areas, you're likely to find an organization that specializes in those areas too.
Just when we were talking about disclosing to the police and to other authorities, and you mentioned about potentially children being at risk, one of the things that I can foresee particularly is that a parent may be worried about disclosing because of the impact on children, because we know that that's once domestic violence and abuse is identified in the home where there are children involved and potentially at risk, then further reports are made to other agencies. Yeah. And of course, I suppose that's where getting this additional support and advice around it is helpful, and signposting those individuals so that
absolutely. And here in the South, one of the flagship councils is Hampshire, interestingly. So Hampshire have worked, and by extension, of course, the Isle of Wight here shares framework. So Hampshire have developed a framework over many years, and it is regarded as one of the best models for this general area of well-being at work and around the domestic abuse and violence area.
I'm conscious of time, and we've been through quite a lot of information here, and we're obviously going to share a few links. But before we kind of wrap things up, is there anything else that you want to share that would be useful to employers or even employees who are listening?
Yeah, well, I am mindful that there was this, I call this sort of first space when somebody discloses to you. I'm mindful of the fact that we haven't really talked that much about that more thorny, difficult in that other space where you might suspect and want to approach the employee. And I think really, it is no more than what we were talking about earlier, these gentle questions about, how are things right now, but also very subtle weaving into conversations. Oh, that's nice. You're wearing that today. That's unusual. Why did you choose to wear that? Or I like your makeup today. What's that? That's great. What's going on? That's unusual. It's almost as if we gently want to pay more attention to people where there may be signs of this. And if you suspect there are signs and really feel confident to open up a conversation with them, then I would definitely urge doing so in those very subtle ways until somebody begins to disclose to you. If they don't disclose, then they don't disclose. And it's then a case of a watching brief from the employer's perspective, just to notice what's going on and to make a note that they've had that conversation with them and everything seems fine in the home working situation right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's understanding that if you have that initial sort of probe or conversation, that if they don't disclose, that you don't then sort of come sort of much harder on it with them. And maybe, like you say, just a watching brief. I think going back to what we're talking about, policies and the training, is if you create that environment in your workplace already, that people understand it's a safe place to make disclosures and that you take these things seriously, and managers get to know their staff really well and understand where the differences are, it will make it much easier in that kind of situation.
Which is why, integrating this within those basic sort of HR policies is really key. And I think you're right. What you're inferring here is that if you're developing on an ongoing basis a culture of openness and a culture where people are respected and relationships are important, then those people who are in this situation are more likely within that culture to be able to disclose.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Ed. So just before we wrap up, just to sort of summarise what we've talked about, I think it's about having an understanding around the different types of DVA, as you explained, introducing a policy and ensuring that managers are trained and aware of it, and then sort of opening up these kind of conversations where somebody makes a disclosure or where you suspect that there might be something going on.
Absolutely right. And it's so in that regard, I have used the word normalise, and that may be misconstrued here. What I mean by that is it's not normal to be experiencing or to even perpetrate DVA. What I mean is for a business to normalise DVA within their culture, within their frameworks, and that allows for an open conversation if necessary.
So thank you so much, Ed. I think that's been really great content and hopefully raises some awareness with employers and HR professionals who listen. And we will, of course, link all the details in the show notes. But before we round off, can you just let everybody know how they can get in touch with you if they want to work with you or to find out more about the kind of work that you do?
Thank you. So there are, as I mentioned before, there are two entities I run. One is the therapy entity, and you can get hold of me through info@iownlp.com. That's Isle of Wight NLP, iownlp.com. And for the leadership stuff and working within businesses in that sort of people development and performance improvement space, it's Edward at BlueTouchPaperConsulting.co.uk.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ed, and thanks for your time.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I hope you agree that was a fantastic content this week from Ed and lots of great information and hopefully educating you on something that you weren't aware of or hadn't been aware of until recently. All of the links and all of the resources will be contained in the show notes, which you can find on realemploymentlawsadvice.co.uk/podcasts. I did say at the beginning of the episode that if you stuck around until the end, there would be something for you. My colleagues and I have developed a domestic violence and abuse policy, which is free for you to download and available on our website. And you can use that as a standalone policy, or you can include it within your handbook. So please feel free to use it to educate your staff and colleagues about domestic violence and the workplace. You can find all the details you need to download at realemploymentlawsadvice.co.uk/DIY-documents. It's free to download and please feel free to share. And of course, if you have any feedback on anything you've heard in today's episode, or if you review the policy and you think actually there's some real gold information that you could share or some additional things that you think should be included, then I'd love to hear from you. It's always great to get feedback, especially on something that's as important as this and is a developing area. You can email me. My email is alison@realemploymentlawadvice.co.uk. And of course, if you have any questions, feedback or suggestions for the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Many thanks for listening, and I hope that you have a fantastic week. Thanks again for listening. Just want to finalise by saying I wouldn't be a lawyer unless I had a legal disclaimer. So I must just say to you that the information in this podcast is for information only. It's general review and a general update. It's always necessary to get specific legal advice about your circumstances. So please don't rely on anything that you've heard in this podcast. But please do feel free to contact me if you'd like further information or specific advice.